somewhere deep in the lowland forests of what we now call southern Mexico, a sound rises before first light. It is the calling of howler monkeys echoing across the canopy, followed by the slow drip of morning dew falling from leaves the size of a man's chest. The air is dense, warm, alive with the breathing of 10,000 creatures. And beneath all of it, beneath the roots and the stone and the dark, humid earth, something remarkable is already stirring. A civilization. Long before the word empire could be applied to them, long before their calendars mapped the movement of Venus with unsettling precision, long before their astronomers sat in stone towers and watched the sky the way a composer listens to silence, the Maya were simply here, living, observing, building. It is a story that begins not with a single king, or a single city, or a single moment of revelation. It begins slowly, the way all great things do, quietly, at the edge of the jungle, where the soil is rich and the rains are generous and the land seems to offer itself to those patient enough to understand it. As early as 2000 BCE, 4,000 years ago, small farming communities were taking root across the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, Belize, and the highlands of Honduras and El Salvador. These were not yet the Maya we picture when we close our eyes and imagine towering pyramids rising above a green sea of forest. These were farmers, potters, people who grew maize and squash, and learned that the movement of stars told them exactly when to plant and when to wait. It was this relationship between the sky above and the earth below that would become the very heartbeat of everything the Maya would eventually create. By around 1000 BCE, something was shifting. Villages were growing, trade routes were forming. A shared language and a shared set of beliefs were quietly weaving these scattered settlements into something larger than themselves. The earliest ceremonial structures began to appear, not yet the great pyramids of later centuries, but platforms of earth and stone that rose above the jungle floor like the first notes of a symphony, simple and searching, reaching upward. Then came the pre-classic period, and with it, the first real breath of greatness. Cities like Nakbay and El Mirador rose in the northern Petén region of present-day Guatemala. El Mirador, in particular, was something the ancient world had rarely seen. At its height, it may have housed tens of thousands of people. Its largest structure, the La Dantar complex, is among the most massive pyramids ever built by any civilization anywhere on Earth. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. And it was constructed more than 2,000 years ago, without steel, without the wheel, without draft animals to haul stone. Only human hands, human ingenuity, and a belief so profound that it could move mountains, or at the very least, build them. By the time the Classic period arrived, roughly 250 CE, the Maya were no longer an emerging civilization. They had arrived, and what they had built was breathtaking in its complexity. At its height, the Maya world encompassed an area of roughly 500,000 square kilometers, a mosaic of city-states, each with its own royal dynasty, its own patron gods, its own particular genius. Tikal in Guatemala, Palenque in Mexico, Copan in Honduras, Caracol in Belize. These were not small outposts. These were metropolises humming with life, connected by raised stone causeways called sacbays that cut through the jungle like rivers of white limestone. At the center of each city stood a king, the Kuhu Ajor, the Holy Lord, whose authority was believed to flow directly from the divine. He was not merely a ruler, he was a conduit between the human world and the realm of the gods. Rulers like Siaj Chan Kawil II of Tikal, or the great Pakal the Great of Palenque, who came to power at the age of 12 and ruled for 68 years, were as much priests as they were warriors. Their portraits were carved into stone. Their deeds were recorded in hieroglyphs that spiraled across temple walls and ceramic vessels and folded books of bark paper called codices, and the people who lived beneath their rule. They were farmers and merchants, weavers and sculptors, mathematicians and healers. The Maya city was a living thing, its markets filled with jade and cacao and obsidian and cotton cloth, its ball courts echoing with the impact of a heavy rubber ball that carried, in every game, the weight of cosmic meaning. The Maya did not simply live in the jungle. They had bent the jungle to their will, carved terraced fields into hillsides, dug reservoirs to catch the rains, and built an agricultural system capable of feeding millions. They developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient world. They conceived of the number zero independently, a concept so elegant, so revolutionary, that many civilizations never arrived at it at all. Their calendar was more accurate than the one most of the world would be using 1,000 years later. This was the Maya, vast and layered and endlessly astonishing, a civilization that emerged not despite the wilderness surrounding it, but because of it, because they listened to it, because they learned its rhythms and matched them with their own. What follows is their story, and there is no need to rush it. There is a moment, known to every archaeologist who has ever worked in the Mesoamerican jungle, that never quite loses its power, no matter how many times it happens. You are moving through dense vegetation, machete in hand, sweat on your brow, the canopy so thick above you that the sky has all but disappeared. And then the undergrowth thins, and the ground beneath your feet begins to rise, and you realize, slowly, that you are not climbing a hill, you are climbing a building. This is how the great cities of the Maya announced themselves, not with open plazas and grand entrances visible from a distance, but gradually, almost shyly, as though the jungle itself is deciding whether you are worthy of the introduction. And then, all at once, you break through the tree line, and there it is. Stone rising from the earth in great stepped tiers, a pyramid so old and so quietly confident in its own existence that the centuries seem, for a moment, to mean very little at all. The architecture of the Maya is not merely impressive, it is communicative. Every stone was placed with intention, every alignment was deliberate. These were not buildings in the way we tend to think of buildings, as structures designed primarily for shelter or utility. A Maya temple was a cosmological statement. It was a mountain made by human hands, because in Maya belief, mountains were sacred. They were the dwelling places of ancestors, the thresholds between the world of the living and the world of what lay beyond. To build a pyramid was to replicate the sacred landscape. To stand at its summit was to stand at the center of the universe. And the Maya built hundreds of them at the height of the classic period, between roughly 250 and 900 CE. The Maya world contained dozens of major cities and hundreds of smaller towns and villages, all connected within a vast and intricate web of trade, politics, rivalry, and shared belief. The largest of these cities was staggering in scale. Tikal, rising from the rainforest of northern Guatemala, covered an area of roughly 65 square kilometers and may have supported a population of well over 100,000 people at its peak. Its 5 great temple pyramids, the tallest of which, Temple 4, rises nearly 65 meters above the forest floor, were visible from miles away, their roof cones cutting into the sky like declarations of divine authority. But Tikal was only one voice in a very large conversation. To the west, in the highlands of what is now the Mexican state of Chiapas, the city of Palenque unfolded along a natural limestone shelf at the foot of the Sierra del Chiapan mountains. Where Tikal was monumental in its verticality, Palenque was elegant, almost lyrical. Its temple of the inscriptions, built to house the tomb of the great ruler Pakal, is considered one of the finest examples of Maya architecture ever constructed. The building's 9 interior levels mirror the 9 levels of Xibalba, the Maya underworld, while its exterior stairway reaches toward the 13 levels of the heavens above. The building was, in other words, a map of the entire cosmos, rendered in limestone, with a dead king resting at its center. That tomb was not discovered until 1952, when the Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruiz Luye noticed a peculiar stone slab in the floor of the temple's upper sanctuary, one with finger holes carved into it, as though it was meant to be lifted. Beneath it, a rubble-filled stairway descended some 25 meters into the heart of the pyramid. At the bottom, sealed behind a triangular stone door, lay a sarcophagus of extraordinary craftsmanship. Pakal had been waiting there, undisturbed, for more than 1,200 years. Palenque reminds us of something essential about Maya cities. They were not static monuments. They were living, breathing places that grew and changed across generations, each new ruler adding to what came before, layering meaning upon meaning the way a forest lays down soil, slowly, patiently, until the depth of it becomes almost impossible to fully measure. The planning of these cities reflected a sophisticated understanding of both the natural world and the celestial one. Maya architects oriented their buildings with remarkable precision. At Chichen Itza, one of the largest and most powerful cities of the later Terminal Classic and early Post-Classic periods, the Great Pyramid, known as El Castillo, was designed so that twice a year, on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the play of sunlight and shadow along its northern staircase creates the unmistakable silhouette of a serpent descending from the heavens to the earth. The effect lasts only a few minutes. It has been happening, reliably and without human assistance, for more than 1,000 years. These were not accidents. The Maya did not stumble into precision. They cultivated it, across generations of careful observation and inherited knowledge, until their understanding of the sky was refined to a degree that still commands the respect of modern astronomers. And yet, for all their grandeur, Maya cities were not built for spectacle alone. They were, first and foremost, places where people lived. Behind the great temple precincts and royal palaces lay the neighborhoods, thousands of modest stone and plaster structures where ordinary Maya families cooked their meals, raised their children, tended their kitchen gardens, and went about the daily work of being human. These residential areas were not afterthoughts. Archaeological surveys of sites like Copan and Caracol have revealed dense, well-organized urban patterns, evidence of zoning, water management, and social hierarchy expressed not in grand monuments, but in the size and placement of domestic structures, the quality of the ceramics left behind, the presence or absence of jade or obsidian in household deposits. Water, in particular, was a governing concern. The lowland Maya lived in a landscape that received abundant rainfall but had very few surface rivers or natural lakes. They solved this problem with an ingenuity that is still striking. Beneath and around their cities, they constructed elaborate systems of reservoirs, great plastered catchment basins that collected rainwater during the wet season and held it through the dry months. At Tikal alone, researchers have identified a network of reservoirs capable of storing tens of millions of liters of water. The entire city, it seems, was designed in part as a water harvesting machine, its plazas and causeways functioning as drainage channels, funneling rainfall towards storage with the efficiency of a system designed by engineers who understood deeply what it meant to live in a world where the rains could not always be counted upon. Beyond the cities themselves, the agricultural landscape was equally transformed. The image of the Maya as jungle dwellers living lightly on the land is, in many ways, a romantic fiction. The Maya reshaped their environment on a massive scale. In the lowland swamps, they constructed vast networks of raised fields, long, parallel ridges of earth, built up above the waterlogged soil, separated by drainage canals that also served as fish farms and sources of aquatic plants. In the highlands, They terraced hillsides to prevent erosion and extend the reach of productive farmland. In the forests, they managed the canopy itself, preserving certain trees, cultivating others, creating what ecologists now call a cultural forest, a landscape that looks wild but is, on closer inspection, quietly tended. Cacao trees grew in the shade of taller species. Breadnut trees, whose starchy seeds could be ground into flour, clustered near settlements. Fruit trees and medicinal plants were distributed with a logic that, once you know to look for it, reveals itself everywhere. This was not a civilization that conquered its environment. It was a civilization that entered into a long conversation with it, one that required patience, observation, and a willingness to think not in years but in generations. And in the quiet spaces between the temples and the farms, in the plazas where the smoke of copal incense drifted upward toward a blue and indifferent sky, the Maya went on living with all the richness and contradiction and ordinary beauty that life, in any era, tends to contain. Markets opened at dawn, loud with the exchange of goods from across the known world. Merchants carried jade from the highlands of Guatemala, obsidian from the volcanic mountains of Mexico, shells from the Caribbean coast, honey from the Yucatan. Cotton cloth dyed in deep indigo and crimson moved along trade routes that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Salt, that most essential of commodities, traveled inland from the coastal flats in great quantities, and above all else, in pouches and jars and carefully wrapped packets. Cacao moved through the Maya world like a kind of liquid currency, valued so highly that it was used as money, offered to gods, and consumed by rulers in frothed ceremonial drinks that archaeologists have now identified in ceramic residues more than 2,000 years old. To walk through a Maya city at its height would have been to walk through a world of almost overwhelming richness, of color and sound and scent, of stone polished white with plaster and painted in brilliant reds and blues, of music, drums and flutes, and the resonant sound of conch shell trumpets echoing between temple walls. It would have been, in every sense of the word, alive. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the night sky as the Maya saw it. No electric light bleeding upward from 1,000 cities. No pale orange glow softening the horizon. Just darkness, pure, absolute, and teeming. A sky so dense with stars that the spaces between them seemed almost an afterthought. The Milky Way arching overhead like a great white river flowing from one edge of the world to the other. The Maya looked at that river and saw something specific. They called it the Wakachan, the world tree, the cosmic axis around which all of existence turned, and they built their entire understanding of the sacred upon that image, a universe layered and interconnected, alive with meaning, in which human beings were not passive observers but active participants in the ongoing work of keeping the world intact. This is where Maya religion begins. Not in fear, exactly, though there was certainly fear. Not in mere superstition, but in a genuine and deeply considered attempt to understand the nature of reality. To locate the human being within the vastness of time and space, and to answer, with as much precision as possible, the questions that have haunted every civilization that has ever drawn breath. Where did we come from? What do the gods ask of us? And what happens when we fail to answer? The Maya cosmos was arranged in 3 great tiers. Above was the heavens, 13 layers of sky, each inhabited by its own divine forces, presided over at the highest level by the supreme creator deity Itzamna, lord of the heavens, of wisdom, of writing itself. He was often depicted as an aged figure, kindly and immense, the originating intelligence behind the order of things. Below the earth lay Xibalba, the place of fright, a dark and labyrinthine underworld ruled by the lords of death, a realm that the souls of the dead were required to navigate through a series of trials that tested courage, wit, and moral character. Between these 2 realms sat the earth itself, the middle world, held up at its four corners by the Bacabs. Divine figures who stood like pillars at the edges of creation, each associated with a color and a direction. East was red, west was black, north was white, south was yellow, and at the very center, rising from the navel of the world, grew the great world tree, connecting all three tiers, its roots descending into Xibalba, its trunk rising through the earth, its branches spreading into the heavens above. The Maya inhabited this cosmological architecture completely. It was not an abstraction. It was the actual structure of the world as they experienced it every single day. And into this structure, the gods moved constantly, creating, destroying, intervening, withdrawing. The Maya pantheon was vast and, to outside eyes, bewilderingly complex. Deities shifted form and identity with the seasons, with the movements of celestial bodies, with the particular moment in the sacred calendar in which they appeared. Chak, the rain god, was both one being and four. A singular force expressed in four directional aspects, his axe striking the clouds to produce lightning, his tears falling as the rains that fed the milpa fields. The maize god, young, beautiful, eternally renewable, was perhaps the most beloved of all divine figures, his death and resurrection each year in the agricultural cycle standing as the central metaphor of Maya existence. Death was not an ending. It was a passage, a necessary darkness before the return of green and growing things. And then there was Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, known to the Aztec as Quetzalcoatl, a deity of wind and wisdom and the morning star, whose image appears across centuries and cultures throughout Mesoamerica, as though some truths were too large to belong to any single people. Serving as the intermediary between this divine world and the human one was the role of the king, but also, critically, the role of the priest and the shaman. Maya religious specialists were not peripheral figures. They were among the most powerful individuals in any city, their influence reaching into every corner of civic life. They maintained the calendars, they supervised the planting seasons, they interpreted omens, conducted divinations, and presided over the ceremonies that punctuated the Maya year with a rhythm of obligation and gratitude. Those ceremonies ranged from the intimate to the spectacular. At the household level, ordinary Maya families maintained small shrines where they burned copal incense, a fragrant resin whose rising smoke was understood as the breath of the divine, a visible bridge between the human and the sacred. They made offerings of food and flowers and the occasional bloodletting, a pinprick of the finger or the ear that served as a token of devotion, a reminder that the self was not merely a private possession but something shared with powers larger than the individual. At the civic level, the ceremonies grew considerably more elaborate. The great plazas of Maya cities were not empty spaces between buildings. They were stages, vast open-air theaters in which the entire community gathered to witness and participate in rituals that reenacted the foundational myths of creation, that renewed the covenant between human beings and gods, and that demonstrated, publicly and unmistakably, the spiritual authority of the ruling dynasty. The ball game occupied a singular place in this ritual landscape, played on long, narrow stone courts with sloped walls. The game involved teams of players striking a heavy rubber ball, sometimes weighing as much as 4 kilograms, using only their hips, thighs, and forearms. It was physically demanding to a degree that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point. But it was also something far more than an athletic contest. The ball game was a reenactment of the journey of the hero twins, the great mythological narrative preserved most fully in the Quiche Maya creation, epic known as the Popol Vuh, in which 2 divine brothers descended into Xibalba, defeated the lords of death through ingenuity and courage, and in doing so set in motion the resurrection of the maize god and the creation of humanity itself. Every game was, in miniature, that story. The ball was the sun. The court was the underworld. The players were, for the duration of the contest, participants in a cosmic drama whose stakes extended far beyond the merely human. What happened to the losers, or, in some accounts, the winners, remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate. The iconography of certain ball courts depicts decapitation, and there is strong evidence that at least some games concluded in ritual sacrifice. But the details vary across time and region, and the game itself took many forms across the centuries of Maya history. What is consistent is the weight of meaning attached to it, the sense that what happened on that stone court mattered, cosmologically, in ways that touched the structure of the world itself. And then there was bloodletting. Of all the ritual practices of the ancient Maya, this is perhaps the one that most unsettles the modern sensibility, yet it is essential to understand it in its own terms. For the Maya, blood was the supreme offering, the most intimate and irreplaceable thing a human being possessed. To shed one's own blood in a ritual context was not an act of violence. It was an act of profound generosity, a gift of the self to the gods who had, in the original act of creation, shed their own blood to animate the first human beings. The debt was real. The offering was its acknowledgement. Kings and queens performed elaborate bloodletting ceremonies on the steps of temples, before assembled crowds, drawing blood from the tongue or the ear, or other sites of the body using stingray spines and obsidian blades. The blood fell onto bark paper, which was then burned, the smoke carrying the offering upward. In an altered state induced by pain and fasting, the ruler might experience visions, divine serpents rising from the smoke, ancestral figures speaking, gods descending momentarily into the human world. These were not performances of cruelty. They were performances of devotion, conducted at the highest level of social authority, in the full view of a community that understood exactly what they were witnessing. The sacred, for the Maya, was not something that existed at a safe remove from daily life, housed in a separate realm that ordinary people visited on special occasions before returning to the practical business of the week. It was woven into everything, into the planting of seeds and the naming of children, into the alignment of doorways and the carving of dates into stone, into the movement of planets and the color of the morning sky. The world was not a neutral place. It was charged, in every corner, with significance, and to live well within it required not just intelligence and labor, but attention, a willingness to listen for what the universe, in its slow and patient way, was always in the process of saying. The Maya listened. For centuries, they listened, and what they heard shaped everything they built and everything they were. There is a number that changed the world. It is, on its surface, the simplest of all numbers, a placeholder, a nothing, a void. And yet the concept of zero, the understanding that absence itself can be quantified and given meaning, is one of the most profound intellectual achievements in the entire history of human thought. Most of the ancient world never arrived at it. The Greeks, for all their philosophical brilliance, did not have it. The Romans, whose engineering legacy still stands across 3 continents, built their entire numerical system without it. It would not appear in Europe until medieval scholars encountered it through Arabic mathematicians who had, in turn, inherited it from India. The Maya had it by the 4th century BCE. They did not discover it accidentally, the way one might stumble upon a useful rock. They arrived at it through centuries of sustained, rigorous, and deeply motivated intellectual inquiry, driven by a need to track time with a precision that no approximate system could ever satisfy. And in doing so, they demonstrated something that deserves to be stated plainly and without qualification. The Maya were among the most sophisticated mathematical minds the ancient world ever produced. Their numerical system was elegantly simple in structure and breathtaking in its reach. where the modern world uses a base 10 system, counting in powers of 10, the way our 10 fingers seem to invite. The Maya worked primarily in base 20, a system almost certainly rooted in the counting of both fingers and toes. 3 symbols did all the work: a dot representing 1, a bar representing 5, and a shell-shaped glyph representing 0. With these 3 elements, Maya mathematicians could express numbers of virtually unlimited size, stacking their notation vertically in columns of increasing positional value. The system was positional, meaning that the location of a symbol within a number determined its value, a conceptual leap that most ancient numerical systems never made. But mathematics, for the Maya, was never an end in itself. It was always in the service of something larger, and that something was time. If there is one subject that consumed the Maya intellectual tradition more completely than any other, it is the nature of time. Not time as a backdrop against which events occur, a passive river flowing indifferently from past to future, but time as a living force, cyclical and sacred, filled with personality and power, in which certain days were inherently auspicious and others were inherently dangerous, and in which the ability to read the calendar correctly was a form of knowledge as practical as it was divine. The Maya did not use one calendar. They used several simultaneously and understood the relationships between them with a mathematical fluency that still impresses specialists today. The Tzolk'in was the sacred calendar, a 260-day cycle formed by the interlocking of 20 named days with 13 numbered positions, producing a sequence of unique day names that repeated every 260 days. Its origins remain debated, but its significance was absolute. Every individual born into the Maya world received a name derived from their birth position in the Tzolk'in, and that name carried with it a destiny, a particular set of qualities and vulnerabilities that would shape the course of a life. Priests known as daykeepers spent years mastering the calendar's subtleties, learning which days favored planting and which favored negotiation, which days were appropriate for travel and which demanded that one stay quietly at home and make offerings. Running alongside it was the Hab, a 365-day solar calendar divided into 18 months of 20 days each, with a 5-day period at the year's end considered so inauspicious that it was called the Wayeb, the days without names, in which the barriers between the human world and the supernatural grew dangerously thin. When the Tzolk'in and the Hab were combined, they produced a grander cycle known as the calendar round, a period of 18,980 days, roughly 52 solar years, in which every possible combination of positions in both calendars occurred exactly once before the whole great wheel reset and began again. To the Maya, this 52-year cycle was a fundamental unit of historical time, a cosmic breath, the completion of a meaningful pattern, and beyond even this, there was the long count, the grandest chronological instrument the Maya devised, and the one that captured the modern world's attention so dramatically in the years leading up to December 2012. The long count was a linear count of days stretching backward to a mythological creation date, a point corresponding roughly to August 11, 3114 BCE in the modern calendar, from which all historical time was measured forward. It was expressed in units that cascaded upward in scale, from single days to groups of 20, to groups of 360, to groups of 7,200, and finally to the great cycle of 100 days known as the Baktun. 13 Baktuns constituted a great era of creation. The completion of 13 Baktuns, which occurred on December 25, 2012, marked not the end of the world, as popular imagination briefly suggested, but simply the closing of one immense cycle and the opening of another. The Maya were tracking time on a scale that makes the entirety of recorded Western history look like a single afternoon. And to do all of this, To maintain these interlocking systems across centuries and cities and dynasties, they needed writing, real writing, not mere record-keeping or simple pictographic notation, but a fully developed system capable of expressing the complete range of human thought, from astronomical calculation to royal biography, to theological argument, to the rhythm of spoken poetry. The Maya script is one of only a handful of fully independent writing systems ever developed in human history. It is also, by general agreement, the most visually beautiful. Its glyphs, of which there are several hundred distinct signs, are rounded, intricate, alive with the suggestion of faces and bodies, many of them representing syllables or sounds that could be combined like building blocks to spell out words phonetically, while others functioned as logograms, representing entire words or concepts in a single elegant image. The two systems, phonetic and logographic, could be combined and interchanged with remarkable flexibility, the way a skilled composer might move between written notation and improvisation. For centuries after the Spanish conquest, the Maya script was considered undecipherable, a locked door behind which a lost world waited in silence. The key, it turned out, lay in a manuscript written by the very man who had ordered the burning of Maya books. In 1566, Bishop Diego de Landa, a figure of profound and painful historical contradiction, completed a document now known as the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, in which he recorded, among many other things, what he believed to be a Maya alphabet. He was not entirely correct in his interpretation, but the information he preserved was enough. Generations of scholars worked at the problem, and in the 20th century, breakthrough followed breakthrough, driven in significant part by the work of the Soviet linguist Yuri Norizov, who demonstrated in the 1950s that the script was phonetically based, and by the American epigrapher Linda Shelley, whose collaborative work with Maya scholars in the 1970s and 1980s finally cracked open the dynastic inscriptions and allowed them to speak again. What they said, when the silence was finally broken, was extraordinary. Not just the names of kings and the dates of battles, though those were there in abundance, but something far more intimate, personal narratives, expressions of grief, records of astronomical observations so precise that modern software can use them to reconstruct the night sky above a specific Maya city on a specific date more than 1,500 years ago and confirm, to within minutes, that the Maya had recorded what they saw with absolute accuracy. They watched Venus with particular intensity, tracking its 504-day synodic cycle, its morning and evening apparitions, its disappearance beneath the horizon, and its reappearance on the other side. Venus, for the Maya, was associated with warfare and with the feathered serpent deity, and its position in the sky was consulted before military campaigns were launched. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving Maya books, preserved in a German library that was itself nearly destroyed in the Second World War, contains Venus tables of such precision that they correct for the slight discrepancy between the observed cycle and a whole number of days, with a sophistication that suggests centuries of accumulated observation and refinement. These were people who looked at the sky, not with wonder alone, but with the focused and disciplined attention of those who understood that the universe operated according to laws, and that those laws could be learned. What they build from that understanding. In stone and in ink, in the movement of shadow across a staircase and in the curl of a glyph carved into a limestone panel, was a record of human intelligence operating at full capacity, reaching, as human intelligence always does at its best, for something beyond what is immediately visible, for pattern, for meaning, for the quiet satisfaction of knowing, as precisely as possible, exactly where one stands in the long, and there is a stone panel in the city of Yaxchilan, carved sometime around 724 CE, that shows 2 figures frozen in a moment of absolute clarity. On the left stands a king, Shield Jaguar the Great, ruler of Yaxchilan for more than 60 years, one of the most powerful men of his age. He holds a flaming torch above his head, his posture easy, almost casual, in the manner of someone accustomed to authority. Beside him kneels his wife, Lady Yutalk, drawing a rope of thorns through her tongue, her blood falling onto bark paper in a bowl at her feet. Her expression, given what she is doing, is extraordinary. She is not grimacing. She is not afraid. She is utterly, serenely present, engaged in an act she understands completely, performing a duty she has accepted not merely as obligation but as privilege. The panel tells us many things simultaneously. It tells us about ritual and devotion and the role of royal women in Maya political life, which was far more significant than was understood for most of the modern era of Maya scholarship. But it also tells us something about power, about what it looked like, how it was maintained, what it demanded of those who held it and those who stood beside it. Power in the Maya world was never simple. It was never merely the product of military strength or inherited title, though it was certainly both of those things. It was a performance, continuously enacted and continuously contested, and understanding it requires us to set aside the idea of the Maya as a single unified empire moving in one direction under one authority, and to see them instead as what they actually were. A constellation of sovereign city-states, each with its own dynasty, its own ambitions, and its own complicated relationships with its neighbors. This is one of the most important distinctions in all of Maya studies, and one that took scholars much of the 20th century to fully appreciate. The Maya were not Rome. There was no single capital, no single emperor whose word carried absolute authority across the entire Maya world. What there was instead was a dynamic, shifting landscape of political power in which great cities rose to regional dominance and then declined, in which alliances were formed and broken across generations, and in which warfare was not an occasional disruption of an otherwise peaceful order, but a structural feature of Maya political life, as regular and as ritualized as the agricultural calendar. Two cities, above all others, came to define the political landscape of the classic period: Tikal and Calakmul, the latter located in what is now the southern Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, were the superpowers of the Maya world, and their rivalry, which stretched across more than 2 centuries, shaped the destinies of virtually every other major city in the region in the way that great power competition has always shaped the fates of smaller states caught between them. Calakmul, whose name means something close to city of the 2 adjacent pyramids, was for a long time less well known than Tikal, simply because the jungle above it was so dense and its inscriptions so heavily eroded. But as the archaeological evidence accumulated across the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a picture emerged of a city that was, at its height, every bit as powerful as its great rival to the south, and considerably more skilled, at least for a time, at the game of political manipulation. The rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul was not primarily fought on the battlefield, though battles certainly occurred. It was fought through a sophisticated system of political alliances, a web of patron-client relationships in which smaller cities pledged loyalty to one great power or the other, receiving in return military protection, trade access, and the reflected prestige of association with a dominant dynasty. Calakmul, at the height of its influence in the late 6th and early 7th centuries CE, had built a coalition of allied cities that effectively encircled Tikal, cutting it off, isolating it, diminishing its access to trade routes and its ability to project power. In 562 CE, that pressure culminated in what inscriptions describe as a star war against Tikal, a military assault timed to the appearance of Venus in the sky, that most martial of Maya celestial omens. Tikal's king was captured. The city entered a period of decline and silence, so pronounced that scholars now call it the hiatus. a roughly 130-year period during which Tikal erected no major monuments and its political voice fell effectively mute. But Tikal was not finished. In 695 CE, a ruler known as Jasur Chan Kawil I, Tikal's king, a man who appears in the inscriptions with a kind of compressed fury, as though the weight of his city's humiliation had been stored within him for years, launched a decisive counterattack against Calakmul. He captured Calakmul's king. He paraded his rival's image through Tikal's plazas in a display of triumph that was also, deliberately, a theological statement. Proof that the gods had turned their favor back toward Tikal, that the long silence had been a prelude rather than an ending. The monuments Jasur Chan Kawil raised to commemorate his victory are among the most triumphant in all of Maya art. The wars themselves, in their physical conduct, were unlike the set-piece battles of many other ancient civilizations. Maya warfare was in large part a raiding enterprise. Fast, targeted, designed not primarily to destroy an enemy city, but to capture its nobles, its warriors, and above all its king. Capture, in the Maya military world, was the supreme objective. A captive ruler could be displayed, humiliated, and ultimately sacrificed in a public ritual that carried enormous theological significance, demonstrating that one dynasty's divine mandate had overcome another's, that the gods had rendered their verdict in the most unambiguous possible terms. Warriors who excelled in this system were celebrated accordingly. The imagery of Maya art is filled with their presence. Figures in elaborate feathered regalia, carrying spears and obsidian-edged clubs, their bodies marked with the jaguar symbolism that connected martial excellence to the power of the night, to the predatory intelligence of the jungle's most formidable creature. The jaguar was everywhere in Maya military culture. Rulers took it into their names. Warriors wrapped themselves in its spotted skin. It represented something the Maya valued deeply in the context of conflict. Not brute force alone, but the combination of patience and sudden, decisive action that the animal embodied so completely. And yet it would be a mistake to reduce the Maya political world to warfare. The same cities that fought each other with such determination also traded with each other, intermarried their royal families across political boundaries, and shared artistic traditions and architectural styles in ways that suggest a common cultural identity that persisted even through periods of intense rivalry. The Maya Great Ball Court at Copan was built by a dynasty with documented connections to Tikal, hundreds of kilometers away. Marriage alliances between cities were celebrated in stone inscriptions with the same care lavished on military victories, because they were understood as equally important instruments of political power. Women, in this context, occupied a role that the earliest generations of Maya scholars significantly underestimated. Royal women were not merely decorative figures or passive conduits of dynastic bloodlines. They were political actors, sometimes of the first importance. Lady Six, Sky of Naranjo, arrived in that city from her home dynasty in 682 CE, and, in the absence of a suitable male heir, effectively ruled Naranjo for decades, conducting military campaigns, commissioning monuments, and stabilizing a dynasty that had been on the verge of collapse. The great Lady Yol Iknal of Palenque ruled in her own right for at least 2 decades in the late 6th century. These were not anomalies to be explained away. They were expressions of a system in which authority derived from bloodline and divine mandate, and women carried both. Power in the Maya world was, in the end, a negotiation between kings and gods, between cities and their rivals, between dynasties and the populations they ruled, between the demands of the present and the accumulated weight of an ancestral past that watched, always, from the carved faces on temple walls. It was a negotiation conducted in jade and obsidian, in the careful phrasing of an inscription, in the timed appearance of a planet in the eastern sky. in the long, patient accumulation of alliance and obligation and reciprocal loyalty that held a complex and fractious world together across 6 centuries of almost uninterrupted political creativity. And for all its violence, for all its ritual demand and its human cost, there was something in it that commands a kind of respect. These were people who took seriously the task of ordering the world, who believed that how power was exercised mattered, cosmologically, finally, in ways that extended beyond the merely human. They were not always right. They were not always just. But they were, without question, always deeply, urgently alive. There is a particular quality of silence that belongs only to abandoned places, not the silence of an empty room, which still carries the expectation of return, of footsteps in the hallway, of voices around the next corner, but the deeper silence of a place that has been genuinely left, where the last fire was extinguished so long ago that the ash has long since blown away, and the walls have begun their slow negotiation with the roots of trees that do not distinguish between stone and soil, between a palace and a hillside, between something built by human hands and something that simply grew. Walk through the ruins of a Maya city that fell during what scholars call the terminal classic collapse, a site like Caracol or Quirigua or the Great Tikal itself, and you will feel that silence in your bones. You will stand in a plaza where tens of thousands of people once gathered at dawn to watch the sun rise above a painted pyramid, and you will hear nothing but the wind through the ceiba trees and the distant percussion of a woodpecker working at a dead trunk somewhere in the canopy above. The question of what happened, of why these cities were abandoned, why the monuments stopped being built, why the long count inscriptions simply cease in city after city across the southern Maya lowlands between roughly 800 and 1000 CE, is one of the most debated questions in all of Mesoamerican archaeology. It is also one of the most frequently misunderstood, particularly by popular accounts that reach for simple explanations to cover what was, in reality, an extraordinarily complex and regionally varied process. Let us begin with what we know. The classic period collapse was real. Between approximately 750 and 950 CE, the great cities of the southern lowlands, the heartland of classic Maya civilization, declined dramatically. Population plummeted. Construction of monumental architecture ceased. Royal courts dissolved. The elaborate administrative systems that had organized agricultural production, long-distance trade, and ritual life across centuries simply stopped functioning. Sites that had supported populations of tens or hundreds of thousands shrank to small, scattered settlements or were abandoned entirely, reclaimed over the following centuries by the patient advance of the forest. This was not a sudden catastrophe. It was not a single event with a single cause that can be pointed to on a map or circled on a timeline. It was a prolonged unraveling, different in its timing and character from city to city, driven by a confluence of pressures that reinforced each other in ways that made recovery, once the spiral began, increasingly difficult to achieve. Drought was almost certainly central to the story. Paleoclimatological research, drawn from lake sediment cores, speleothems from cave systems, and isotopic analysis of ancient soils, has revealed that the terminal classic period coincided with a series of severe and prolonged droughts across the Maya lowlands, particularly between roughly 800 and 1000 CE. For a civilization whose agricultural productivity depended so critically on rainfall, and whose sophisticated water management systems were designed to buffer against dry seasons rather than multi-year failures, sustained drought was an existential threat. Reservoirs emptied, crops failed. The surplus production that had fed urban populations and supported the specialist classes, the artisans, the priests, the administrators, the warriors, contracted sharply, and into that contraction, political violence poured with devastating effect. The same geopolitical dynamics that had made the classic period so politically creative, the rivalry of great powers, the shifting coalitions of allied cities, the warfare conducted along lines of prestige and divine mandate, became catastrophically destructive when resources grew scarce. Cities that had competed for captives and glory now competed for water and food. The frequency and intensity of warfare increased sharply in the Terminal Classic, as the inscriptional and archaeological records both confirm. Alliances collapsed. Smaller cities that had depended on the stability of the great powers found themselves exposed and vulnerable. The administrative networks that had organized trade across hundreds of kilometers fragmented, cutting cities off from goods and resources they had long taken for granted. And there was, underlying all of this, a deeper structural vulnerability. The classic Maya political system had become, across its centuries of success, extraordinarily top-heavy. The demands placed on agricultural populations by royal courts that grew increasingly elaborate, by elite classes that expanded continuously, by building programs that required vast quantities of human labor. These demands did not shrink during periods of environmental stress. They persisted, because the political and religious logic that justified them persisted, even as the capacity of the land to sustain them declined. There is evidence from skeletal populations of the Terminal Classic period of increasing nutritional stress among ordinary Maya people, of diets that were narrowing, of bodies that were working harder and eating less. And there is evidence, in the abandonment patterns of some sites, that the collapse of elite authority was not always mourned by the populations that had lived beneath it. But here is where the story requires its most important correction. The Maya did not vanish. This point cannot be made too strongly or too often, because the idea that they did, that the Maya were a lost civilization, a people who disappeared into the jungle and left only their ruins behind, is one of the most persistent and most damaging misconceptions in popular historical memory. It strips from a living people the continuity of their own existence. It transforms them from ancestors into artifacts. The Maya of the southern lowlands did not disappear when their great cities were abandoned. They moved, they reorganized, they carried their language and their calendar and their cosmology and their agricultural knowledge with them, into new configurations, in new places, under new political arrangements. Many migrated northward, into the Yucatan Peninsula, where cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal rose to prominence in precisely the period when the southern lowland cities were declining, fed in part by the population movements of the collapse, absorbing and transforming the traditions of the south into new and vital hybrid forms. Chichen Itza, in particular, became something genuinely new, a city that blended classic Maya traditions with influences from central Mexico into an architectural and political style that was neither purely Maya nor purely anything else, but something original and powerful. It dominated the northern lowlands for centuries, drawing pilgrims and traders from across Mesoamerica to its sacred cenote, the great natural well into which offerings of jade and gold and, occasionally, human lives were cast as gifts to the rain deity dwelling in the dark water below. When Chichen Itza itself declined, in the 12th century, power shifted to Mayapan, a walled city that served as the political capital of the northern lowlands until its own violent collapse in the mid-15th century, barely a generation before the Spanish arrived. And when the Spanish did arrive, when Francisco de Montejo and his forces began their brutal and protracted campaign to subdue the Yucatan Peninsula in the 1520s, they did not find empty ruins and a vanished people. They found a living civilization. They found cities and markets and agricultural fields and political hierarchies and religious specialists who maintained calendrical traditions stretching back 2,000 years. They found people who resisted conquest with a tenacity that surprised and frustrated the Spanish for nearly 2 decades, and in some regions considerably longer. They found the Maya. The conquest, when it finally came, was a catastrophe of incalculable proportions. The violence of the military campaigns, the devastation of introduced diseases against which indigenous populations had no immunity, the systematic destruction of cultural institutions, the burning of books, the suppression of religious practice, the dismantling of political authority, combined to produce a demographic and cultural collapse that killed millions and fractured the transmission of knowledge across generations in ways whose consequences are still felt today. Diego de Landa, the bishop who burned the books, later expressed something approaching remorse, recording in his conflicted chronicle details of Maya culture and writing that would eventually help scholars recover what he had helped to destroy. History rarely offers ironies so complete, and yet even through all of this, through conquest and epidemic and forced conversion and the long grinding weight of colonial oppression, the Maya persisted. They preserved what they could in ways that were available to them. They encoded traditional knowledge in Christian forms. They maintained calendrical practices in secret. They told the old stories in new languages, or in the old languages quietly, in places where the wrong ears could not hear. Today, more than 7 million people across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador speak one of the 30 or so languages in the Maya family. They tend milpa fields using agricultural knowledge refined across 3,000 years of practice. They maintain calendrical traditions that connect them directly to the intellectual achievements of the classic period. They are not the remnants of a lost civilization. They are its continuation. The pyramids still stand, patient in the jungle, their stones still carrying the inscriptions of kings whose names we can now read. The calendars still turn. The cacao still grows in the shade of taller trees, just as it always has, and somewhere in the highlands of Guatemala, as the sun goes down and the stars begin to appear, a daykeeper consults a calendar that has been turning without interruption for more than 2,000 years and marks the day for what it is. Not an ending, never an ending, just another day in the long, unbroken count. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not live in books. It lives in hands, in the specific angle at which a farmer drives a planting stick into soil that has been worked by his family for 40 generations, in the way a midwife reads the position of a child in the womb, using only her palms and a knowledge passed woman to woman across centuries. In the moment, a daykeeper closes his eyes and feels, without having to calculate, exactly where the sacred calendar stands, the way a musician feels, the pulse of a piece of music in the body before the mind has time to count the beats. This is the knowledge that no conquest fully destroys. It can be driven underground. It can be fragmented, interrupted, forced to disguise itself in borrowed forms. But it has a persistence that outlasts the ambitions of those who would end it, because it does not reside in any single place or any single person, but in the accumulated living practice of a community that carries it forward simply by continuing to exist. The Maya carried it forward. Through 3 centuries of colonial rule, through the upheavals of independence, and the violent political history of the 19th and 20th centuries in Mexico and Central America, through land dispossession and forced labor and educational systems designed to replace indigenous identity with a national one. Through all of it, the knowledge moved, quietly, stubbornly, with the same patient determination that the roots of a ceiba tree bring to the slow work of splitting stone. And now, in the early decades of the 21st century, something remarkable is happening. The world is turning back toward the Maya, not with the romantic projection of earlier centuries, which tended to see the ancient Maya as a mysterious lost people whose achievements could only be explained by invoking the extraordinary, as though indigenous people were incapable of genius without supernatural assistance. but with genuine scholarly rigor, with new technologies that are revealing the full extent of what was built and what was known, and with a growing recognition that the Maya themselves, the living, present-day communities, are the rightful inheritors and interpreters of that legacy. The revolution in our understanding of the ancient Maya has been, in recent decades, nothing short of extraordinary. And much of it has been driven not by the excavation of new sites, though that continues, but by a technology that looks at the landscape itself in a new way. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, is an airborne laser scanning system that fires millions of pulses of laser light at the ground per second and measures their return time to build a precise three-dimensional model of the terrain below. In a rainforest, this means that the canopy effectively disappears. The laser pulses filter through leaves and branches and map the ground surface beneath with a resolution that no satellite image and no ground survey could hope to match. When researchers began applying LiDAR surveys to Maya regions in the 2010s, the results were, even for specialists, staggering. In 2018, a consortium of archaeologists published the results of a LiDAR survey covering more than 2,100 square kilometers of northern Guatemala, the largest such survey yet conducted in the Maya region. What the data revealed was a landscape of almost incomprehensible density, not the scattered cities separated by empty jungle that earlier models had imagined, but a continuous, interconnected urban landscape of extraordinary complexity. Tens of thousands of previously unknown structures, hundreds of kilometers of causeways linking cities, towns, and villages into a single integrated network, agricultural terracing and water management features extending across the landscape on a scale that suggested a total population, at the height of the Classic period, that may have reached 10 or even 15 million people. 10 to 15 million people. In a rainforest, sustained by an agricultural system of such sophistication that it transformed the landscape at a continental scale, and did so for centuries without the kind of catastrophic soil degradation that modern industrial agriculture produces in decades. That last point is one that researchers are beginning to take with increasing seriousness. The raised field agriculture of the Maya lowlands, those long parallel ridges built above swampy ground, separated by canals that served simultaneously as drainage systems, fish farms, and sources of aquatic vegetation for composting, represents a model of intensive, sustainable food production that modern agricultural science is only beginning to fully understand and appreciate. The Maya did not exhaust their soils. They enriched them. They managed water not by fighting against the landscape, but by working with it, by understanding its patterns well enough to use them. In a world increasingly confronted by the consequences of exactly the opposite approach, by soil depletion and water scarcity and the fragility of food systems built on the assumption of unlimited resources, this is not merely historically interesting, it is urgently relevant. The same can be said of Maya approaches to forest management, the cultural forests that Maya communities maintained around their settlements. Those carefully tended mosaics of useful species that looked to European eyes like untouched wilderness are now understood to have been among the most productive and biodiverse agricultural systems ever developed. Modern agroforestry, one of the most promising fields in sustainable agriculture, draws directly on principles that Maya farmers were practicing 2,000 years ago. The knowledge that encoded those principles did not die with the Classic period cities. It survived, adapted, continued, and in many Maya communities, it is still practiced today by farmers who may or may not know the archaeological dimensions of what they are doing, but who know, from their own experience, that it works. The astronomical legacy of the Maya has found a similarly unexpected modern resonance. The precision with which Maya observers tracked the movements of Venus, the Moon, and the Sun The tables they compiled, the cycles they identified, the corrections they applied to bring observed data into alignment with theoretical models, represent a body of empirical knowledge that was, in its own terms, fully scientific. Not science in the institutional sense, not laboratories and peer review and the apparatus of the modern research enterprise, but science in the foundational sense: systematic observation, recorded data, pattern recognition, predictive modeling, and the willingness to revise one's models when the observations demanded it. There is a lesson in that too, one that extends beyond the specific content of what the Maya knew to the question of how they came to know it. They watched the sky not for one generation or 10, but for hundreds, accumulating a body of data so rich and so carefully maintained that the patterns within it became visible only across timescales that exceed any individual human life. They understood, in practice, if not in those words, that some questions require more time than a single person has, and that the only adequate response to such questions is to build institutions, calendrical, scribal, priestly, capable of holding and extending the inquiry across generations. This is, at its core, what civilization means: the ability to think longer than a lifetime. The Maya did not think in years. They thought in baktons, in periods of 104,000 days. They inscribed dates on their monuments that reached back millions of years into a mythological past and projected forward into a future so distant it makes the present moment feel like a single breath held and released. They were, in the most literal possible sense, a civilization that took the long view. And what does the long view show us, looking back at them now? It shows us cities that rose from the jungle floor through the labor and ingenuity of people who had no iron, no wheel, no beast of burden heavier than a dog, and built structures that have outlasted every empire that came after them. It shows us a written tradition of extraordinary sophistication, a mathematical system of elegant power, an astronomical knowledge refined across half a millennium of patient watching. It shows us a political world of remarkable complexity, in which power was contested and negotiated and expressed through forms that were simultaneously practical and cosmologically meaningful. It shows us farmers who fed millions without destroying the land that fed them, artists who carved in stone an emotional range, grief and triumph and devotion and humor and tenderness that speaks across 20 centuries without requiring translation. It shows us, in other words, human beings. Fully, completely, brilliantly human beings, with all the creativity and contradiction that implies, capable of extraordinary beauty and considerable cruelty, of intellectual achievements that still astonish and political failures that still instruct, of a relationship with the natural world that was, at its best, a model of attentiveness and reciprocity that we have been losing and are only now beginning to understand we need to recover. The jungle remembers all of it, in the roots that have split the stones of Tikal's plazas, and in the soil that has settled over Kalakmol's causeways, and in the ceiba trees that grow from the rubble of Palenque's outer walls. The jungle is engaged in its own slow process of documentation, pressing itself against every surface the Maya left behind, reading them in the only language available to it, taking the measure of what was built and who built it and what it meant. And in the highlands of Chiapas and the forests of the Petén and the coastal lowlands of the Yucatan, the descendants of the people who built all of it are still here, still planting and weaving and counting the days and telling the old stories in voices that carry, beneath every word, the long resonance of everything that came before. The pyramids still rise above the canopy at dawn, their stones catching the first light the way they always have, patiently, without drama, as